I don't know why it wouldn't come on before, but it seems to be here now. So the question is, should a seller pay buyer agent commission? Now I'm going to set the scenario like this. It's a medium demand market, maybe sort of like we're in California right now. And the seller has a home listed for, let's just pick round numbers, $2 million. And the offer comes in at $1,950,000. And the seller is saying, and all the other terms are met, could have been after a few rounds of negotiation, but the seller's there, but there's still a 3% request for buyer agent compensation. And the question now is, should the seller counter that to zero? Because why should the seller pay buyer agent commission when the seller already has an offer in their hand? So I will show you what an offer looks like right behind us. And let's say the purchase price was written in at $1,950,000. And then the buyer or the buyer's agent wrote in this 3% number. Now, first of all, there's a couple of things going on here. I wouldn't want to necessarily, if I can accept all the other terms as the seller, but I counter while we're in this agreement, if I counter, so now we'll go back, and this is the first round, and I counter out that 3%, I've rejected that offer. So already I don't like these forms. I don't like what they're doing to sellers. I don't like the way they're, if I'm working for the seller and I'm an attorney, I don't like the way the listing agent has, like the listing agent, the listing agent's going to have to practice law without a license if they're going to respond properly to a request of 3%. Because let me just show you. This is what a buyer counteroffer would look like, right? And so I pre-wrote this. Buyers hereby, G3 is unchecked. Any request for compensation buyer's broker must be made in a separate written agreement. Now, if you did that in the first round, and in the second round, they've sent over two agreements, one for 3% and one for the price and the terms of the home that you can accept, seller could really put some pressure on the buyer's agent by accepting the new terms. So that's the one, let's call it the 1,950. And this term would no longer be here, right? This would be now subject to a second agreement. So the seller could say, yes, we've agreed. Boom, we're done. House is sold, 1,950, closing in 30 days. We are hereby countering separate agreement. And now a negotiation between the buyer and the buyer's agent. I'm sorry, separate negotiation, really, for the buyer agent commissions. Now, as a seller, I'd advise the seller to never really go to zero, because zero can play into the buyer's fears and their cold feet and not having an advisor. I would consider, instead of $60,000, I would consider 5 or 10. I would seriously say, with respect to buyer agent commission, seller counters to $5,000 payable to any agent or an attorney, whatever buyer desires, or something like that. Now, some attorneys might even say, I wouldn't even suggest who the agent has to be. $5,000 to a professional to help, or you could just counter to $5,000. Those are all things an attorney should be explaining to the seller. I don't see how a listing agent can do that. The listing agent couldn't bifurcate it into two separate things. The listing agent can't mitigate the risks. I would also seriously suggest to a seller that I would choose a flat fee, a flat dollar amount, rather than a percentage, because the DOJ said that buyers would be interested in knowing that their agent wasn't being incentivized to have them pay more money, especially in multiple offer negotiations. I would think that's very important. But now let's just focus on the task at hand. They've requested $3,000. I'm sorry, $30,000 or $60,000. They've requested 3%, and you're wanting to counter. You have to know, what are the chances of the buyer walking away or the buyer's agent making the buyer pay the difference? So to the buyer, they're still feeling that they're going to be $55,000 light if you counter to $5,000. And that's where things get really tricky. Like, as a seller, you should know that most likely, well, you know, if they're working with an agent and the agent saw your home with a buyer's agent, they would have to be working with this agreement here. This is the buyer broker agreement, and it is a tricky one. And I don't even see how your listing agent can explain these things to you. But here is where the amount of compensation would be written in. It'd be 3% right here. And then the question becomes, well, will this buyer have to pay that agent out of his or her or their own pocket? And that's the answer that we don't really know. I'm hearing lots of agents are telling the buyer that don't worry, if seller doesn't pay us that much money, if they're paying us something, we'll still help you buy the property. But they're not putting that in writing. And I can tell you from experience in the past, if your agent's telling you they'll work with you, even if they can't get the 3%, they only get 1% or 2%, you need to make sure that that broker has signed it. That's just an aside. But let me just say, I'm sorry that this is just legalese and analysis of contracts, but it's really important to understand what the seller, what the buyer's agent can do. I don't even understand how this all works together. But let's read these. It says here that the buyer's agent has a choice of not enforcing this agreement. So it's based on, I think it was G up here, right? So we go, buyer does not have sufficient funds to pay broker. So if you're a buyer and you're like, well, I don't have $60,000 in cash, I'd rather put it down on my deposit, or it has to go into my deposit. Then the agent says, don't worry, we'll get the seller to pay, right? So right there, price fixing is built into these forms. Right there, steering is built into these forms. Because what happens if the seller doesn't offer the 3%, the $60,000 in this case? And the buyer's already told the seller that they don't have the money to the buyer's agent, they don't have the money to pay the buyer's agent. This is a critical term. Down here, the agent is allowed to walk away and not enforce the term. Let me see. Dispute resolution, legally authorizing seller entire agreement. Where did I'm sorry if this is the problem with doing lives. Here it is. If the box is checked in paragraph 2G2 for any property for which buyer writes an offer to purchase, buyer agrees to include a term in the buyer's offer requesting seller to compensate buyer's broker. So that's G3. Buyer's agreeing to have, basically now the buyer's agent comes along, checks this box, and writes in their commission as part of the purchase offer. So right there, we're already getting on tenuous fiduciary grounds. Are they really representing the buyer's best interest when they're writing this term into their purchase agreement? The real estate association will argue yes. I'm sure plaintiff's lawyers could figure out the reasons why. I'd say, I don't know. That's a pretty sketchy proposal, right? But let's come back down here to the G3 clause again. G2, sorry. Buyer agrees to include a term in buyer's offer requesting seller compensate buyer's broker. That was G3 in the purchase agreement. And then this contingency, for a transaction, this agreement is contingent upon seller or others or both agreeing to pay broker the full amount that buyer is contractually obligated to pay broker. So if they wrote in 3%, that's the full amount, 3% of the purchase price. And they're saying it's contingent upon the seller doing that. If the seller doesn't offer the 3%, this contingency is favor of the broker. So it's entirely up to the buyer's agent's broker. And the broker may elect to cancel this agreement. So if they're not getting the 3%, the broker could elect to cancel. Related to the represent, so they could do it on a one property at a time basis. So they could agree to cancel with respect to this property if the seller does not agree to pay the full amount to buyer. That buyer is contractually obligated to pay broker. Broker shall inform buyer, seller, and listing agent if that buyer is proceeding without representation, and they shall compete a new agency confirmation removing broker as representing buyer. So in one scenario, if you offer as a seller less money than the buyer is requesting in the contract, and really it's the buyer's agent once that box is checked, then the buyer's agent has a right to say buyer's proceeding without me. Now, my question is, because if you read the rest of it, it still looks like if the buyer goes ahead and buys the house, they still owe the money to the buyer's agent. So it doesn't say this continues in favor of the broker. To cancel this agreement related to representation with that specific property. So the broker can cancel. But there's all these other this is not well written, because when you read the rest of it, there's all these other clauses in here saying if buyer goes in and buys the property, they owe the agent money. So, I mean, if I'm representing the buyer, I'd say, this continues in favor of broker. Broker may elect to cancel this agreement related to representation if the seller does not agree to pay the full amount that buyer is contractually obligated to pay broker. Okay, the seller may cancel. And it says broker shall inform buyer, seller, and listing agent that the buyer is proceeding without representation. So even that's not clear. Like, is it possible the buyer agent could say, well, if I'm not getting paid the full amount, I'm going to tell them you're moving out on your own, but they haven't canceled the entire agreement? Like, this is a crazy clause. And I'm talking about from the buyer and the buyer agent's perspective. Now, what game is the seller paying? I will also point out another thing. If you go to the Department of Real Estate Handbook or the Department of Real Estate website, I've put up other videos where and this is a paraphrase, but it's very close to the reality. It says, as a fiduciary, an agent has a duty to put their client's interest ahead of their own, and they're not supposed to compete. And I would say that when you're telling your buyer, or you're threatening them, or you've got these clauses that say, if I don't get paid, I can cancel I can cancel this agreement. I can tell the listing agent and the seller you're representing on your own. But I'm not letting you out. I mean, those are odd choices. Or what if they just don't let them out? What if they say, no, we still want to go ahead. You've informed me that you don't have the money to pay me, but you have an agreement with me and we're not canceling. I mean, this is a problem for sellers. So when you counter to zero, you don't know what the buyer's agent is going to do and what sort of bind or contract they have over the buyer's agent. So I would say that this entire process, once G3 is checked by a buyer, it's untenable for a seller, a listing agent, to proceed without putting an attorney on your team. because you're locked into this steering mechanism. Like the the National Association of Realtors site says on it that steering is steering towards or away from properties based on the level of compensation. If you're not agreeing to pay buyer agent compensation, your contract could get canceled or not accepted, and the buyer is going to be brought with the buyer's agents to other properties. I mean, it's written in steering. High commissions are kind of written in, because if the seller doesn't agree to pay what's requested, you don't even know if the buyer can still go ahead and close because of that buyer agent agreement. So the question becomes, what should a seller do? Well, first of all, you should demand that your listing agent has an attorney on the team, or they're paying an attorney to some degree, so that you can be advised of the risks, mitigate the risks, advise on proper counters, like not just in the beginning, but the whole way through. I mean, you should be bifurcating this into two separate negotiations. And that will put more leverage. If you've agreed to the terms on the price of the home, and you're only, and now you can negotiate buyer agent compensation. And if you actually have someone you've given them written authorization, like an attorney broker, and you say, I'd like you to represent me in the negotiations, not just for the price of the home, but with the buyer agent compensation, that person can get on the phone and start pre-negotiating ahead of time. You can say, hey, we're about ready to accept, or we could accept these terms, or we're $1,000 away and I'll eat that out of my own money. That's what the agent can say. So we're done with negotiating for the price of the home, but we still have your negotiations to take care of. So if we counter to 1% here, can we go forward? Or we're going to counter to you right now. We're going to counter buyer agent commissions to 1.5%. If you accept, we will send over an acceptance of the listing of the offer. I mean, there's so many ways a seller can gain advantage when being advised by an attorney, and what constitutes a rejection and what does not. And someone could actually represent them on the phone and talk. I mean, it's thousands of dollars in net. It's going to, if you're doing this prospectively, it's also going to very likely get higher offers. But what you need is someone who can negotiate. So now the final question is, should a seller, it's not the final question, it leads into the final question. Should a seller pay buyer agent commission? Well, if there's a lot of offers coming in, that's one thing. If your home's priced really well and there's a lot of demand in the market, that's one consideration. If it's the only offer you might see for 3 or 4 months, that's another consideration. But I can tell you how I would resolve all these tensions. The ideal way, the way we sold our home most recently for a client, and that is to create a multiple offer scenario and give yourself the best chance to have a transparent process where the buyers compete against each other. And as the offer prices start coming up closer and closer to fair market value, you'll just see that people don't want to overpay for the home. They all have an idea where the home is, and they just stop going up in price. But then they start finding other ways to win, and they start negotiating down buyer agent compensation. You need to be, if you're saying, I want the best of both worlds, I don't mind. If I get a good price for my home, I'm willing to pay buyer agent compensation. Then you should be working with someone, an attorney. Well, you could ask your realtor and their broker in writing, will you broadcast buyer agent compensation? Will you go to the broker caravans and let realtors know? Will you put it up on social media? Will you put it on yard signs? Will you send out emails to strong brokers or talk about it? Like most agents are going to tell you, we're not equipped. We can't talk about buyer agent compensation. We'll get a suit. You as a principal can do it. You as an attorney representing the principal can do it. So really the way to do this is to spend a warm-up week or warm-up 3 or 4 days doing the marketing, offering the buyer agent compensation. And then if you're going to hire a broker to represent you in these negotiations, then engage the real estate agent. Do the marketing, make the offers, have your mitigation steps in place, and then, at least for that first weekend, try to stimulate and work towards having a multiple offer weekend scenario and then the proper negotiating. So you can learn more about this at listingattorney.com. Attorneys, I hope I just even slightly explained why listing agents, because they don't have the forms and they're not licensed and it's a third-party contract, they cannot do the optimal job for sellers. In fact, when they allow a seller to offer buyer agent compensation, they've either breached their fiduciary duty or they're going to have to practice law without a license. Like, how are they going to choose between just responding on the blank lines of a counteroffer form or bifurcating this into a separate negotiation for the price and terms of the home and for the buyer agent compensation? It's a third-party clause in G3. It's a third-party beneficiary clause. The proper response is to bifurcate. When they're choosing to go one, they're compromised right there. They're compromising most sellers' ability to sell for the highest net and be protected. So, attorneys, you should be getting paid $6,000 to $10,000 at the close, even say up to 50% of the buyer's agent commissions because you're doing the work. Listing agents, you should be working with attorneys ahead of time so that they can advise your sellers well and you can get the job done. Find out more at listingattorney.com. Thank you.